Gonna get started?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we're here. I'm Pascale, and this is Yuri, as you know. And we're presenting the Fabula-NET project, which is coming to an end actually this year. Started in 2021. And generally, it's a project about predicting and understanding some sort of literary quality. So that can be reader appreciation at a large scale, like Goodreads ratings or something, or it can be something like cultural longevity, so what we understand as some kind of canonicity of literary works. So this talk, we're just going to introduce a little bit the project, talk about some theoretical starting points, talking about linking quality to intertextual features, and then talk a little bit more about the quality concept itself, so talking about it as a multidimensional concept. And then some more recent experiments where we try to model quality as this multidimensional concept, and then some tentative conclusions that we hope we can come to. Yes, so this is us. And the questions, the initial questions of the project was like, what is literary quality? Do readers converge on some kind of perception of literary quality? And is it possible to predict it or model it from textual features? But also considering some extra textual features, like Ida Marie is working on like gender biases and things in literary reviews. And yeah, these are large questions, so we're just presenting some steps. And so we started very small with small data sets, very few texts. And we started with two main measures. So this is the Hurst exponent and approximate entropy, and I will come back to that and explain it more. And when we basically went like bigger and bigger, now we're working with a corpus of 9,000 nouns. We have various proxies of quality, what we call proxies, so way of approximating what quality can be, and various textual features at various levels of the text. And the project started basically. So there have been other projects like this. There was a big one also in the Netherlands just before ours started, and many of these studies that try to predict reader appreciation kind of use these like stylistic features. So have like a bag of words approach that you just like count the number of passive verbs or something like that. So various, like a large collection of features, but still very like on the surface. And this project was very interested in the structure of narrative texts instead. So what is like the underlying features of narrative text rather than the surface. And of course this is a simplification, these things work together. But it might be a useful simplification. And so Matthew Jockers in 2015 was the first to like introduce this idea that you could model literary text with a narrative arc. And he's basically saying that this can be a proxy for plot. So you can measure plot by looking at how negative or positive is the text at every point. So this is from The Little Mermaid. And we can see that this kind of corresponds to narrative events. And yeah, Kurt Vonnegut was the first one to introduce this idea about the shapes of stories. He had a master's thesis in the 50s that got rejected. So we have these like visual representations of narratives, and some people might use these as some kind of analytical aid, so understanding how a text works, how it looks like, which is a big thing in literary studies. And this project was more interested in like what are the dynamics of these arcs. So as you can see, like the Old Man and the Sea on the top here is kind of like more chaotic than the one on the bottom, which is The Artist as a Young Man. From James Joyce, and you can see it goes like more smoothly into dips and ups. And this is something that the Hurst exponent can measure. So the Hurst exponent measures like the persistence of arcs. So if it gets positive in sentiment, does it continue to get positive? If it gets negative, does it continue? So how persistent is it in like its trends? And here we have like just a visualization of the Hurst again. So a high Hurst would have like a more persistent arcs, while a medium and a low Hurst would have like more random oscillations. Two just text examples just to get an idea of like what sentiment analysis would rate the words as. So here we have Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, so it's kind of like oscillating more randomly. While something like James Joyce, the ending of James Joyce, like where it goes like into this yes, 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 just going higher and higher, which would probably be a more persistent arc. So basically, we're converting text to arcs and then doing measures of the arcs, so dynamic measures of the arcs. And Yuri is going to talk more about linking these measures to quality.
Right. So once we had these measures, our first question was to see whether we could find any linking between these aspects of the narrative arc and the quality. And by quality, of course, one of the questions was how do we define that, or what do we mean by that? So just a disclaimer, I have half of my mouth that doesn't work very well, so sorry if I slur a bit. So in our first experiment in the project, we decided to take a small corpus, which were all the fairy tales of Andersen, translated in English, and to compute the sentiment arcs on them. And the reason for doing that was that basically having this, you have a corpus that is very controlled, so it's always the same author, it's always the same genre, same period, of course. It's literary, but the stories are also very simple in some sense of the content, so it's a good case scenario. And we basically computed the sentiment arcs of each story of Andersen, and then we computed this Hearst exponent that we saw before. And for quality, we decided to go with kind of the majority rule. So we took a platform like Goodreads, in which you would have hundreds of thousands of people saying how much they like this story, and we went with just the average of the average stars that they gave on the fairy tale. So very brutal. But what we found was that actually there was a correlation, quite stark actually, between the average stars that the story got and this feature of their sentiment arc. So basically how predictable in some sense it was. So when you went on to Hearst exponents that are very low, you would have stories that tended to be very zigzaggy and much more simple in some sense, so like a series of obstacles that are resolved in a systematic way, and like the appreciation, if you want, the Goodreads stars went down, and then but we saw that the more you went up with the Hearst, so we had stories that were more like smooth in some sense, and more coherent, if you want, story arcs, the more the appreciation went up, and also here we found most of Andersen's canon, so those stories there were mostly included in anthologies. Since we had the good results, we tried to reproduce this with the Grimm brothers translations. Now the Grimm brothers tend to have a bit more complex stories than Andersen, tendenzially. And what we saw when we basically did exactly the same thing, so we just put the Hearst exponent of all their sentiment arcs on the X and the Goodreads scores on the Y. And in this case what we found was that we did have a correlation again, even with the Grimm brothers, but there was a breaking point. So up to a point of the Hearst exponent, which was very similar to the point in which Andersen was the highest, we actually did have the same positive correlation between these characteristic of the narrative arc and how much people like the story. But when we went beyond the given level of, let's say, self-predictability, the appreciation started going down. And again, most of the canon on the Grimms, the one that you have in anthologies and so forth, would happen here at the breaking point in the sweet spot. So since we were having this, sorry, I'm running a bit, but since we were having these good results, we decided to scale up with more text, and we we basically managed to put our hands on a gigantic corpus for literary studies sizes of over 9,000 novels in English language, manually polished, that was collected by the University of Chicago, so we call it the Chicago Corpus, and that represents thousands of different authors from the end of the 19th century down to the end of the 20th century, in all sorts of different genres with all sorts of different receptions. So unfortunately they are copyrighted, so we cannot distribute them immediately to everyone. But if you can use them under the hood, so to speak, it's one of the largest that we know. And with this, we try to go more bold, and so instead of just going with fairy tales, we try to escalate to full novels. And it's more like sanity check that we did, which was a bit daring, of course, was to try to take all the novels of all the recipients of the Nobel Prize for Literature in the corpus and compare them compare the sentiment arcs Hurst exponent with every other book that was written in the same 2-3 years as a control group, so to speak. Which is quite daring, of course, because I mean, receiving the Nobel Prize is, I mean, you can only get one person a year, so it's like, you know, you can probably have a lot of good misses. But we still found that in general, when you took the general population tended to have a statistically significant higher Hurst than the Nobels, as if the Nobels tended to be more daring in the construction of their narrative arc, if you want to generalize it that way. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, and then with this big corpus, we also collected various more of these, what we call quality proxies. So a lot of other studies that try to predict reader appreciation use like one gold standard, so for example, Goodreads rating, or a number of library holdings or something, and just try to predict that score. But there are various other ways of measuring or like evaluating literature in the literary culture. So for example, like what's the rank on Wikipedia of the author? Is it included in the Penguin's classics? Did it win a prize of some kind, for example, a genre prize or a more literary general fiction prize? Is it how many times has it been translated, and so on. So the question for one of our experiments was like these various different forms of quality. How do they interrelate? Do they kind of measure the same thing, or do they represent like the taste and interest of certain audiences or certain groups and so on? So that's what we did. And so other studies have kind of relied on a sort of like, there's a canon and then there's a popular work. So they have like a popularity axis and a prestige axis. So Porter, for example, sets them up against each other and then just plots works on these both axes. And we can basically do the same. So for example, here is the Goodreads rating count on the y-axis. And on the x-axis is how many times does the title appear in college syllabi. So that's some kind of measure of canonicity or like an institutional canon. And it's like intuitively it seems to make sense. So we have like Fitzgerald up top, we have George Orwell, George R.R. Martin up here, very popular. Here we have Henry James, for example, on the more prestige side. And this is using Goodreads ratings. So how many people have rated the book. But if we move to Goodreads average rating, so what did they give the book, what score did they give the book, the picture looks very different. So suddenly Fitzgerald and Golding move way down, James moves way down. So this is just to say that there, even if we use one site like Goodreads, there's no like uniform measure of popularity or something. There seems to be various forms of popularity. And also these various proxies might interact in very unpredictable ways. So for example, Walsh and Antoniak found that the Goodreads classics, like what good people on Goodreads think are the classics, overlap very much with college canon. And others found that winning a prize, you will get more popularity, but you might also get a lower average rating. So these kinds of things also works with higher ratings might have a higher standard deviation, so like represent very polarized audiences. So these kinds of things. And some of these proxies might have to do with both prestige and popularity. For example, library holdings, which is kind of selected by experts, but also responds to like a user demand. So very complex. And so we collected 16 of these various proxies from like Penguin, which works are included in the Penguin Classics, to various prizes like the National Book Award, Pulitzer, but also genre prizes like the Hugo Awards. Which are discrete proxies, which are like, for example, did they win an award or not? Are they included in the anthology or not? And then we have some more continuous proxies, like how many translations did the book have, from 1 to 1,000, what's the Wikipedia rank, and so on. So the study was annotating the whole Chicago corpus for these quality proxies, these 16 proxies, and then gauging like the interrelations of these proxies. Nothing fancy, just doing correlations and looking at distributions, and finding that some proxies seem to interrelate more than others. And you can see this a little bit on this heat map, which is just based on Spearman correlations. So it seems to be some kind of island up here, where things like the Goodreads average, the libraries, the translations are interrelated, and there seems to be some kind of island in the middle, where like the Northern Anthology, the Penguin Classics, which works are in open syllabus and so on are interrelated. So some kind of popularity island, some kind of canonicity island. But we also see here the prices seem to be forming like a kind of third island. And then we also see some proxies that seem to like move across the board. So they have correlations with both islands. So things like translations, Wikipedia rank to an extent, and Goodreads rating count, but also things like bestsellers. So they might be both canonic and popular. We also see that some of them do not correlate across the board. So things like libraries seem to have most correlations with the more popular proxies, while things like the genre prizes, romantic, sci-fi, fantasy, seem to have not very much correlation with either of them. So they're kind of more disparate. And we can see this a little bit better if we visualize it like a map. So it's basically the same. So the edges are based on the correlation coefficient, and the sizes are how big they are. So we see this like kind of canonicity, literariness triangle, but we also see fantasy awards, sci-fi awards, romantic awards, very, very disparate. So it's kind of, we see proxies that have various different actors. So there are publishers who make the Penguin Classics, there are professors or literary scholars who make what goes on the syllabi, and they seem to be like converging on some sort of shared perception, which might be canonicity, which might be literariness or something, but there's the question of what to call these different groupings. Then we look at just the distribution of discrete proxies within the continuous proxies. So say romantic awards might not have a correlation with, for example, Goodreads rating, but if romantic award books have a higher, like systematically higher Goodreads rating, then they're also like connected in a way, but not correlated. So here, for example, rating count on the y-axis, and then the different discrete proxies here. And we can see, for example, here with average rating, that the romantic awards do seem to have a systematically higher average rating. Also the Goodreads Best 20th Century list, which is like a user-generated list. And if we go on to libraries and translations, we see kind of a flipped picture. So in libraries, the more canonic titles seem to have very, very low averages. So Penguin Classics, Open Syllabus, Goodreads Classics, and so on. While the sci-fi prices and the general fiction prices are very high. On the other hand, if we look at translations, it's like the reverse. So the canonic proxies have a higher, and the genre prices and literary prices are lower. And the same in Wikipedia rank. So there it seems like the more canonicity proxies predominate. Yeah, so key takeaways are something like there seems to be a flipped picture. They seem to be measuring some kind of different thing, especially when we see this switch between them. And also that, that for example, long-listed awards are popular in libraries, but not so much in Wikipedia rank or in being translated. And some proxies appear continuously high, consistently high, like the Goodreads Classic or the Goodreads Best 20th Century books. So there might be some that might be better to use if you're just trying to predict one score, because they kind of move across different perceptions of quality. And I think the main takeaway here is that you cannot base quality proxy on some kind of actor-based definition. So just because it's a publisher and not a scholar, they're not going to necessarily have a different perception of quality. And also that these genre awards seem very disconnected from all the others. Yeah, and then we're basically taking this linking it to textual features.
Yeah. How are we with time? I think we are good, right?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. So, exactly. So we had, after our early experiments, we have scaled up in text and we have scaled up in quality measures. So we have this corpus made of a lot of novels measured along many, many dimensions of quality, depending on how you considered it. And as Pascale was saying, we wanted to see whether there was a connection, again, basically between all these quality dimensions and the features of these novels. but we had started only with the narrative arc, which is important, but of course it was based on sentiment analysis, and so it was a part of the whole story. And the previous studies, especially from Stanford, that tried to look a little bit into that. Of course, they also looked at other features of the text, especially what we called before surface features, which would basically be the style. And I think that the stylistic level is actually usually considered one of the most important, or at least as important as the structural part, and for some schools of thought is even more important when it comes to artistic writing than the structural part, because it's basically, well, okay, this is a bit of a side note, but like we could discuss whether it's basically how you say things that matters even more, because it's you are conveying an emotion, an experience in some way. But that's one of the most important things that arguably literary language might do. So once we had all of this, the next thing that we wanted to do was to scale in terms of features and go beyond the sentiment analysis arcs features, and also try to go towards the style and what we call the surface features. Now, of course, the thing is that you can use a lot of linguistic features to capture style. What we did was to start with readability. Now, readability is a concept in linguistics that is implemented through many different kind of algorithms that linguists have developed in the last 50 years. They tend to be very simple algorithms, but they have been used and tested in a lot of different domains. And the idea is that basically these algorithms, here are the names of some of them, they try to tell you how readable a text is for, let's say, kind of general audience that is not an expert. And they're usually based on, let's say, length of sentence, length of words, because these things tend to be more cognitively demanding. Longer words tend to be rarer and more specific, and so on. So we collected 5 of these, the most popular, the most tested measures for readability, and we basically used them to annotate all of our corpus and see whether there was any correlation with some of these quality proxies that we collected. And the long story short is that basically yes, there was a relation, and the relation was not the same for all the proxies. So when you have some proxies that are like the number of libraries that hold the title, the number of people that rate a book, and things like that, there was basically a positive correlation with readability, meaning that the more readable the text was, in the sense that I kind of a little bit defined before, the more it would be held by more libraries, it would be rated by more people, it seemed to be spreading more in some way. While, for example, other proxies that seem to be more what we call expert-based, so few people who are experts sit in a room and say if the book is, for example, has to be long-listed for an award, those ones tend to actually even dislike a bit the readability in some sense. So there was a correlation, but it was in 2 different directions. And we also saw that there was then a correlation with the narrative structure, that is what we started with. So simpler structures at the narrative level seem to correlate a bit with simpler style. So a simpler style also had to do with an arc that was a little bit more coherent or more predictable, if you want the negative side of it. Or the more, we were wondering whether maybe more complex structures even need the more complex style. Of course, that's, I don't think is the case, but basically we saw that there was a bit this double clustering, with exceptions. Okay, so since we saw that, then basically what we did after is that we went out and collected a lot of other features that have been amply used in linguistics, in computational linguistics, to capture the main aspects of style. For example, they're using author detection and things like that. So we tried to do nothing that had to do with lexicon, because we didn't want to, let's say, capture that some authors always use the same, I don't know, actual word. We wanted to try to measure more abstract elements of style. But we did collect things like, so we didn't collect unigrams and bigrams, that's what I meant. But we did collect like lexical diversity, the level of redundancy, the average word and sentence length, entropy, and so forth. And also the syntactic level, the frequency of various parts of speech, the percentage of passive verbs. Some of these ideas also came from like popular knowledge about how some schools of writing say that you should write fiction, so avoid passive verbs and and adverbs and so forth. So we try to have a diversified representation of the stylistic level, so to speak. And then, and then we also collected some more on the sentiment level, and we even had the emotion arcs, and we will not have time to go through them, of course, unfortunately here. So the main idea was to try to have the stylistic side and the structural side more represented, to have more features for all of them. And then once we had done that, the question was, can we predict actually, like, can we use some of these features to train, for example, a classifier or a regressor to predict what will be the quality or the reception, in some sense, of a given book that it hasn't seen before. So if you expose it to, 7,000 books with these characteristics, and we tell them this was the reception, can you predict the reception of a book it hasn't seen? So this was a machine learning experiment, and the answer basically was that to an extent, better than random, you could basically train a regressor that was trained with the stylometric and the sentiment features of a novel, and it would pick up on a combination of weights on these elements that it allowed it to do some not random prediction on books that it hasn't seen before. And we also found that here it's a bit small, but you can see that this is random. This is like the real values versus predicted values once you feed it, once you train it, so you can see that like, there is quite of an inclination there. And we also found that the accuracy and the F-score of these models was even better once you also added semantic categories. So we also tried to go to use the Roger thesaurus, which was also here, I think, which is a big thesaurus of that brings all English language words to some semantic categories like dog is goes to animal and so forth. And it has been used in many studies on literary quality before. And basically, the idea was that we wanted to see whether, like, also the diversity of the topics touched in some sense helped, and that helped even more. So basically, when we added all these three dimensions, statistics, sentiment, and a little bit of the semantic, we actually got to a decent, more than decent level of predictability for the number of libraries holding the title, the number of Goodreads scores, the average Goodreads scores, and so forth. It also allowed us to do a little bit of error analysis. I cannot go much into detail here, but we could see that basically, if you were only using, for example, the semantic categories, you would these models would be very good at predicting a series of books that tended to be kind of pop books, if you want, or kind of bestseller types. Well, if you only use the surplus of statistic features, the best predicted ones, so the ones that the models were best at saying this will be the reception of it, were more like on the high brow ones. While there were some that were consistently failing, and our hypothesis was that these ones, for example, had big movie adaptations and so forth. But that was just a side. I mean, there would be more for that. Okay, so these were like our first long run of machine learning analysis. And what we did after that was that after we had all these features, we escalated to another feature that is much used in linguistics, which is perplexity. And perplexity is kind of an overarching feature because it's a feature of how much surprising a text is for a language model. So now that we can use very large language models like GPT-2, we could basically see how much the sequence of words in a text that kind of encapsulate everything from syntax to semantics, how surprising it is, how unusual it is. And with collaboration with some other researchers, we could train some ad hoc GPT models and then see, first of all, if the correlation of their perplexity on these books had anything to do with other linguistic features, and then whether it had to do with the reception. So the point of perplexity is particularly interesting, I think, because it's used in linguistics in general to kind of gauge how much new information is in a text. So it can be used in many, many different kinds of linguistic settings, but it also has to coincide with how creative language use is, because basically every time that you use an unusual word or that you use an unusual construction, the perplexity is going to go up. So it's a measure that kind of brings them both together. And what we found was that there was actually a strong correlation, like the strong divide between canonical and highbrow novels, especially canonical, they tended to be very perplexing. So they actually were stranger, while the ones that tended to have proxies that had to do more with spreading, like bestsellers, good number of Goodreads rating scores, and so forth, they had a distinctly lower perplexity. And this perplexity, we tried to see what kind of linguistic features it correlated with most, because we tried to understand what was happening, and it often had to do with the presence of specific syntactic elements that are considered, in linguistics, that tend to be correlated with what is called the conventionality expressivity continuum. Just to go a bit faster, basically, when you are trying to win a noisy channel, so you have, for example, a lot of people that you are talking to that don't know much about the topic, or there is something that is hampering communication in any way, you go towards the conventionality. While for example, if you are in an expert-to-expert communication, or you have an ideal channel of communication, you go towards expressivity, and this is what seemed to be happening here with canonical novels having more the behavior of this kind of texts here, and the other ones having more of the behavior of the conventional here. Okay. And so finally, we're almost at the end. Once we had all of this, what we did most recently was try, okay, let's try to put everything in that we have collected and see how good we are at doing, again, a classification, in this case not a regression, between the different kinds of quality that we have seen. So basically, first of all, to see whether we can differentiate each quality type from the rest. So we can take all these textual features and can we actually predict whether the text that the model hasn't seen will be canonical versus non-canonical and things like that. And then again, we'll receive an award versus, well, will be long-listed for an award versus not, and so forth. And then see whether you can even divide between many of these, right? So if it will be more likely to be canonical or to be a bestseller and so on. Now, obviously, these categories are not mutually exclusive, so they overlap. You have, for example, a strong overlap between canonical text, as we define them, and novels. So it means that many Nobel authors have written things that have been then included in canonical anthologies. You have an overlap between bestsellers, a little bit of an overlap between bestsellers and prizes, but not so much, and so forth. But what we did was that basically we only took the texts that were only in one category and in no other, in order to avoid any overlap. So we only took canons that were not bestsellers, that were not novels, and so forth. And even by doing that, we could see that basically this is the confusion matrix of our classifier, fed with all of our features. And you can see that the strongest points are in the diagonal, which means that it's more often right than wrong. Not only it's like that, but also it tends to confuse more with texts that tend to have a higher overlap. So even if you take texts that are only canonical or that are only, let's say, bestsellers and so forth, still they tend to have distinguishable macro profiles, distinguishable enough that you can predict what the book will belong to, and this macro profile seems to be closer to each other in a way that reproduces this overlap. So actually the canon's macro profile, there seems to be something like that. And that would be a little bit closer to, let's say, the bestseller macro profile than the long-listed, something like that. So basically, there seems to be a distinguishable profile for these mega categories, and they tend to be kind of closer to one another, like to tend to cluster in different ways, which is then reproduced in reality. So this was our last experiment, and also we did, as I was saying before, the binary classification. Can you tell if a text will be canonical or not? Can you tell if it will be written by Nobel or not? And the accuracy for some of these things is very high, considering the difficulty of the text. So that was quite impressive, at least for us, that this could be done to an extent. Okay, so now I bring you shortly to the conclusions. I couldn't talk about everything, but basically I think what some of our main observations for now from all this story is that, first of all, when you have a large scale enough, which we hope we have, literary novels, they seem to cluster according to textual features in a coherent way. So if you have all of these textual features and you see how they cluster, they tend to make meaningful clusters that have to do, so as I was saying before, more readable text also have more predictable sentiment lines and so forth. So in that sense, it's kind of a coherent clustering. And secondly, these macro clusters seem to correspond to different groups of quality. So the one that is kind of more simpler, speaking in a rough way, will also correlate with some kinds of quality. For example, the kinds of quality that have to do with more popularity and being catchy and spreading between different readers and so forth. And the more complex one tend to have to do more with highbrow and so forth. And also, if we try to link this a little bit with the features that they have and the linguistic meaning of those features, we can see that the novels of the group that I would call spreading fast, popular, catchy, and so forth, they tend to maximize on the level of the coherence on the structural level or redundancy on the statistic level, while the ones that I would call highbrow, canonical, expert selected, they tend to maximize more on the level of the diversity, for example, a larger lexicon, less predictable, more diverse series of syntactic constructions, and complexity at all these levels. And this makes me think, at least as a linguist, again, this conventionality expressivity continuum, so that when you have some kind of communication that is more hampered to some extent, or you want to reach more people, or you want it to be more robust in any way, you will try to err on the level of conventionality, and that will allow you to have your message through noise. Otherwise, you can maximize on expressivity, meaning you will try to say more in less time and give more information or a stronger experience to the reader, but that will make it much more cognitively demanding for the reader. But of course, it's important, and then I close that. To underline that in what we see in the real data, every quality proxy has a slightly different profile, and every novel strikes an equilibrium between these things. So it's not that they are all in one box or all in the other at all. They're like very fuzzy clouds, and you're going to have authors that, for example, are very close to one group from one respect, but very close to another from another respect. So if you look for authors, there are authors that have a very readable, simple, redundant style, but unpredictable or not so predictable narrative line. So they kind of combine the two things, like Hemingway or Faulkner and some of those, kind of simply profound, if you want. Well, Nabokov does the opposite and so forth. So there is much more to be seen from there. Okay, so that was about that for me, and we also have the two small side jobs in case you're interested for any collaboration. For the one of you are here, or if you're interested in that,
I think we have a few minutes.
Yeah.
So these are like parallel tracks that we've kind of worked on. Meanwhile, also, so that was something like evaluating sentiment analysis tools. So this is also, we worked some on emotion annotation and compared sentiment annotation to emotion annotation before. And we did one study this year, just before Christmas, where we compared different tools to analyze literary text. So the problem with sentiment analysis tools is they're often trained on social media data. So it's the question of how good are they at capturing things in literary narratives, right? So what we did was we just took The Old Man of the Sea, so one text, and we just annotated it by hand, by humans, and we compared it to various tools. So these are both dictionary based, so that will have a word that has a corresponding score, or transformer based. And what we found here was that something like the shoe-shed, which has been very criticized for having some errors, is actually doing the best on the level of detrended arts. So these are not raw values; these are employing a smoothing technique, while transformers were better at the level of raw values. So there's a kind of difference here. But also that the shoe-shed is trained on literary data. So that's the only one, a dictionary that's trained on literary data. So there might be some argument here for saying, let's do more training on literary data to make literary tools, so on. And then we worked more on the same text, but looking at the sentences where humans and models disagree. So we wanted to do some kind of error analysis where we say, okay, when the disagreement happens, what is it that is happening here? And are there some features of the text that might be able to identify these passages? So do the sentences where humans and models disagree have some higher prevalence of, for example, arousal, concreteness, or visuality, or something like that. So we just took two groups. We took sentences where humans and models aligned, and we took sentences where humans and models disagreed. And we just compared the two groups in terms of features. And what we found here was that the blue is here what we call the implicit group. So the group where humans and models disagree, and the explicit is where we agree, and that they have lower values of arousal, but higher values of concreteness, and sometimes higher levels of visuality. So that is to say that they seem to be more descriptive, describing more objects, describing more scenery, and these kinds of things. And it kind of corresponds very well to an idea in literary theory, which is called the objective correlative, which was introduced by T.S. Eliot, which is this idea that literature uses objects to communicate feelings. So instead of saying, like you might do on social media, oh, today I was walking down the street, I was very, very happy, while you're using very explicit words, you're also using high levels of arousal, because you're using words that refer to feelings. Then literary language would say something like, oh, I was walking down the street, the sun was shining, the trees were green, so using this imagery to communicate emotion. So this is something that we are still working on, that we're hoping to make a paper about, which I think is very cool. Yeah. But that's basically it. Then we have also a data set of the entire corpus that you're welcome to go in and play with, where we cannot release the full text, but we have released all the features, the sentiment arcs, and these kinds of things. 9,000 laws, so that's just to go and play. Some sources, and thank you for your attention.